Here is the agenda for today's presentation, and I don't know how many of you may have attended previous webinars on the decision model, but if so, the first 4 topics are a brief review and will also be good for people who are being introduced to the decision model for the first time. The real-world experiences I'm going to share with you and the software innovation are definitely new, probably in the last year or so. So what I want to do for all of you is to start with how most organizations manage business rules today if they are not aware of the decision model. And in fact, I'll be perfectly honest with you, it's exactly the way we used to manage them ourselves. But the problem was that it had shortcomings, and it drove us to seek a much more practical and strategic approach. And that's what we came up with, the idea of the decision model. So on this page, this is actually a process model from a real client. I know you can't read the details, but regardless, it probably looks much like other process models, and it looks very much like process models we have created in the past. And what this model shows is that the business rules are not in the process model themselves, in theory. They are actually denoted by pointers, those little red notes in there, that point to the business rules, and the business rules are stored someplace else. And that someplace else can be a business rule repository or a catalog, or some people use requirements tools to do that. And at first glance, this sounds like a really good solution because we've been told to separate business rules from other models, and it looks like we've done a pretty good job. But in this project and other ones that we've worked on, the business rules really became unmanageable in a rather short amount of time and with a very few numbers of business rules. That's because they were just individual orphans, they were just pointers. There was no universal way of grouping them or diagramming them in a form that can complement the process model or any other model. So as a data person, I have to say, in an eerie way, the business rules in this approach became as unmanageable as our data elements were in data dictionaries in the 1960s and the 1970s. And the way we solved that problem was we used the relational model as a rigorous, theoretical, but stable model for modeling data totally separate from processes or use cases or requirements, and capturing that model in a universal rigor. So we were starting to think about that. What could we do in the business rule space that would deliver us that kind of flexibility and that kind of separation? So this process model, though, actually not only includes business rules as those little red pointers, but it actually has business rules disguised as parts of process. And you'll see that in a few pages in more detail. But in other words, there might be a task box that says evaluate person's credit score, and then another one that says evaluate their employment history. And as I'll show you later, a lot of times those kinds of task boxes are basically business rules in disguise. And because they're business rules in disguise, the process models become very complicated, and they start filling in all the walls of a conference room, and the process itself becomes more complicated than it really needs to be. And that's why the title of this page asks us if this is familiar and if this is acceptable. And we had decided that it was not acceptable, after many years, by the way, of doing it. So the question came to us is, what if we had a model that universally organized business rules and logic in the same way that the relational model organizes data? If we had such a model, we could remove all the business rule identifiers from the process model and point instead to an entire model of business rules and logic that would just plug in, just like we kind of point to a whole data model or a database. We don't point to individual data elements. So that's exactly what this page shows. The partial process model on the left does not have any business rule pointers or any notation of any kind about business rules, except for those little blue octagons. They may look like circles to you, but they're octagons that you can see in 2 of the boxes. Now, each of these octagons indicates that behind that task is an entire model of business rules and logic. And if you follow the top task box with the little blue octagon, you follow the arrow to the right, you will see a decision model there and what it looks like. This particular decision model has these 5 green icons or tablet shapes, which is a little bit different than the one in the middle. And so that decision model actually contains all of the logic behind the business rules that before we would have pointed to with arrows and all kinds of things in the process model. So if you were to drill down into one of these green tablet icons, you would see a rule family table. So there are two parts to the decision model, which you'll see in great detail. There's the structural model, much like a data model or an object model, except that it's different. And that's the green tablets and how they're related to each other. And then there's the detailed content. What's behind each of those tablets is its own two-dimensional, almost like a decision table. It's not exactly a decision table because it's governed by principles including normalization rules that guide you to create the table, each table, in only one way. And that's what gives us a rigor similar to the relational model. So not only do decision models create cleaner process models, which I'm going to show you, but we've learned that they turn out to be faster to build and automate than any other approach we have tried. And I'll give you some real numbers in a few minutes. They also promote shared understanding between business and IT. And I'll go so far as to say we have business people, in some cases, creating the decision models and validating them before they turn them over to business analysts or in conjunction with business analysts before turning them over to IT. They have reduced the time and cost of making changes by up to 30 to 70%. And the magnitude of this reduction is possible because the decision models eliminate the need to translate business rule statements in the past into natural language or templates or special grammar. We don't do that anymore, and because it was time-consuming and it didn't deliver us what we needed. So another advantage is decision models turn out to reduce the time and cost of testing, because if you want to create test cases for one of the decision models on this page, you need fewer test cases than if you really didn't have the model at all, because you don't need to test every combination and permutation. You can look at the model and see where the boundary points are. It's the most amazing thing that we've discovered recently, as the decision model minimizes programmer intervention when a change is required. So you'll be able to see in our case studies actual changes in time, and business people are able to understand these models and go in and make a somewhat major change, validate it against the normalization principles, and test it against test cases, and then request it to be deployed with minimal or no programmer intervention. So that is what we're working on today. So we'll see a little bit more about with decision models and process models in a little bit. So let me show you first how to build a decision model from the bottom up, because that's how you're going to learn a little bit more about how we populate them and how we create their structure. So to build a decision model from the bottom up, we have to start with pieces of business rules or business logic and assemble them into a model. So this page starts us off by defining what we mean by business logic. It's not exactly the same as people use the word business rule. So just listen to this for a second. Business logic is the means by which a business derives conclusions from conditions, because that's what the word logic is all about. In order to come up with a model, we need a structure to the sentences. If we can put together conditions and conclusions, then we have a natural structure of logic. So the simplest kind of business logic is an expression that evaluates only one condition to determine the corresponding value of one conclusion. And we have an example right on this page. In this example, we want to check whether a person's credit rating is less than 650, and if it is, the business wants to conclude that their likelihood of defaulting on a loan is high. So when we can associate conditions with conclusions, we start to have a structure to our sentence, and then we can start to build a model that reflects that structure. But more importantly, though, we want the model to be universally rigorous. This means we want there to be one and only one way that you can create a model from any set of conditions leading to conclusions. We want every decision modeler given the same